is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and here's what's coming up on today's program. Investors brace for key U.S. inflation data tomorrow as hopes for a Fed pivot start to fade. Well, U.S. fighters down a fourth flying object as tensions rise between Washington and Beijing. A Chinese news outlet says authorities there are preparing to down a UFO near a naval base. Plus, the death toll in Turkey and Syria from last week's earthquakes approaches 35,000. A business group sees an $84 billion hit to the Turkish economy. Now, let's check on the markets. Of course, it's a big week when we have that CPI data out of the U.S. tomorrow. The U.S., of course, very much in focus to try and understand what that means in the fight against inflation. European stocks, for the moment, are actually posting some pretty modest gains. U.S. futures are retreating a touch again. Investors trying to position themselves ahead of that CPI data. Treasuries seem to be range-bound. We'll see, well, the U.S. two-year yield at 4.5323. Again, we did have a sell-off in U.S. government debt on Friday, and that pushed up the 10-year Treasury yield by 7 basis points. Overall, we're seeing they're small gains. They're gains, but, small gains, 0.7% higher, 0.4% higher for the DAX. We're also getting some breaking news. EU is lowering the euro area 2023 inflation forecast to 5.6% versus 6.1%. It's raising its euro area growth forecast to 0.9% versus 0.3% prior. Now, I think we'll break it down for you so that you fully understand exactly what we're looking at. We also had a good conversation with the governor of the Central Bank of Portugal on inflation, what that means for that March. He says really that March meeting for the ECB is extremely important. Markets now pricing in a 50 basis point hike. Now, U.S. forces have shot down 4 unidentified objects over North America in less than 2 weeks and a third in as many days. The latest object was taken down over Lake Huron in Michigan over the weekend. And in the past hour, China has said U.S. balloons have trespassed more than 10 times since last year. Let's get the latest now with Bloomberg's Rebecca Chung-Wilkins. Rebecca, what we know is that U.S. military has never shot an object in U.S. space before. Now they've done 4 in 4 days. What does that tell us?
Absolutely. We are in somewhat uncharted territory here, and that is partly because it does seem like the surveillance and the use of this type of technology in particular has, for the most part, somewhat gone under the radar. China today, just within the last hour, saying that over the past year, since early 2022, the US has illegally flown at least 10 balloons over China, and so very much sort of putting it back onto the US. And we do know that the US has sort of increased its spending in this sort of development, and at least the development of balloon technology over the last sort of couple of years.
So, Rebecca, what's the political response, right? How are lawmakers reacting to this? I know there's also talk about UFOs, which frankly we don't really know what to do with.
Certainly, I think the domestic pressures for both Xi Jinping and Biden are pretty clear here. I mean, Biden has faced some quite sort of robust pressure from Congress to take action and to be quite sort of responsive. And in fact, I think, the fact that we've seen the downing of 3 balloons or 3 unverified objects in 3 days is some ways sort of an indicator of this heightened sense of scrutiny that the Pentagon and the White House is under right now. More broadly, I think we will also start to see countries now responding publicly to this claim that the US has made, that this is China's sort of surveillance balloon as part of a much bigger global program. And of course, on the UK, for example, we've seen the UK saying they're going to launch a review to look into whether there need to be changes in how the British assess that surveillance of their airspace too. So I think we can see the US sort of trying to use this transparency push to try and see if it can win support from partners and allies. So that's another thing to keep watching now.
So what could this mean for US-China relations going forward?
It certainly doesn't feel like we are anywhere close to reaching that floor, which, feels like sort of months ago now. But when we were thinking about Biden just a couple of weeks ago, was meant to be going to Beijing to try and normalize relations. Now, it's worth mentioning that so far, although China has sort of retained and reserved its right to retaliate, has been relatively muted so far. And we could still see potentially a Blinken trip. Blinken has only postponed that visit. But of course, if he does go, the window is shutting because we have the MPC conference coming up. And he will, of course, have to go with a much stronger message than typically we would have expected. So certainly no normalization in relations that we were hoping for as of yet.
Rebecca, thank you. Rebecca Chun-Wilkins for us from Hong Kong. Now let's get straight to your Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Bloomberg has learned that Gautam Adani's conglomerate has halved its revenue growth target and plans to hold off on new capital expenditure. We're told the growth target has been cut from 40% to between 15 and 20%. That's as a group looks to rebuild investor confidence after a massive sell-off in its shares and also bonds. India's Finance Minister says the country is discussing ways to develop a standardized global framework for regulating cryptocurrencies. The talks with G20 members come as India holds the group's presidency this year, with crypto regulation and climate change likely to be among the key topics of discussion. India introduced heavy taxes on cryptocurrencies last year. And LG Chem says it's prioritizing efforts to secure raw materials used in EV batteries. In an exclusive interview, the CEO of the Korean energy giant told us the company is working on establishing a self-sufficient global supply chain.
We are preparing ourselves for the, first of all, secure supply of raw material, which is more important than the price. What if don't have material to produce? And the price becomes secondary. So our first and foremost priority is to secure enough raw material for the future.
Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans, and this is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thanks so much. Coming up, traders await the Valentine's Day U.S. CPI reading, but will it be heartache or heartbreak? We have more on that story next. This is Bloomberg.
I think the Fed understands that it doesn't understand, because no one can know the future with confidence. And I think that the Fed is determined to do what's necessary. That's certainly what I hope is the case in a substantially uncertain environment. I think the consensus has become substantially too complacent about inflation.
Well, that was the former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers saying that the market has just become too complacent about inflation. While staying on the inflation theme, U.S. CPI data due out tomorrow and will be closely watched as hopes fade for a Federal Reserve pivot. Now, for more on all of this, we're joined by Adam Cole, Chief Currency Strategist at RBC. Adam, good morning. A huge day tomorrow as the market tries to figure out whether the fight against inflation is being won or whether there's still a lot more to do. Where do you think we are?
So I think we're on the fence a little bit at the moment in that debate, and the consensus is for a fairly steep and sustained fall in inflation this year. And if anything, I think we see that as a little bit complacent at the moment. And the incoming data has a high information content, and that expectation may well be challenged in the coming months. So as I say, I think we're as in the dark as the Fed is, and very sensitive to incoming information. For this week's data, I think the risk is fairly symmetric. that we would see a fairly sharp market reaction to an upside or a downside surprise on the core number in tomorrow's data.
Adam, what have you found so interesting so far, actually? I know we had some data that actually pointed to a much hotter economy than expected. I mean, how many quarters or how many months does it take to make a proper trend? And how volatile are you expecting the U.S. economy to be also because of COVID lags?
So more than 1 month's data for sure, of course. But I think another couple of months of employment data suggesting that trend is starting to pick up again. Not necessarily the 500,000 jobs that we saw in the January release, but anything that suggests the trend is picking up from where we thought it was, of perhaps 150 or 200,000, would again call into question the idea that we've seen, or we can see, the peak in policy rates, the peak in inflation, the bottom for the equity markets, etc., and all of those trades that hang on the peak in inflation being in place start to get called into question again. And again, I think that there is a strong consensus in the market that this year is the mirror image of last year being all about bonds and equities selling off together and the dollar rallying. Consensus this year is that bonds and equities rally together and the dollar sells off. And incoming data so far this year have challenged that view, and I think there's every reason to think that will remain the case for a few months.
So, Adam, the other, of course, big story, and I don't know whether for markets it's actually bigger than maybe the U.S. CPI print, is what's happening with the Bank of Japan. Whoever comes after Governor Kuroda, how much will they be able to keep a lot of the speculators at bay, and what does that mean for yen?
So I think that's very much where the flow comes from in terms of the BOJ. And in the near term, at least, assuming Ueda is confirmed on the official announcement tomorrow, I think my recollection of Ueda when he was on the BOJ policy board back in the early 2000s is that he takes a very pragmatic view of things. He's very hard to pigeonhole as hawkish or dovish, much more practical, much more pragmatic view of the world. And I think he's not said a great deal for the decade that he's been in academia, and we need to look to his early comments, perhaps at confirmation hearings, for some more direction on that. But the key point for me, however, is that drives positioning outside Japan in terms of JGBs and dollar yen. The flow from within Japan is much more driven by the expectation for the Fed than the BOJ, where you have much more leverage in terms of Japanese investors' domestic flow. And on balance, I still think that flow is dollar yen positive in the longer term. So once we get through the next couple of weeks and the dust settles, I think that trend reasserts itself.
I mean, where does the dust settle to? So it's very clear that speculators think that, look, the BOJ's cap on government bond yields will eventually have to be scrapped. What if it wasn't so?
So I don't think JGB yields are that far from the equilibrium they'd be at if there were no yield curve control at the moment. If you look at JGB yields, the 10-year, the target rate, relative to other parts of the yield curve or relative to other low-yielding markets internationally, the adjustment post the widening of the band in December, I think, took us most of the way to where JGB yields would be in the absence of yield curve control. So clearly we are ultimately on the road to that policy being adjusted or abandoned, but any additional upward pressure on JGB yields from here largely, I think, comes from a build-up of speculative positions outside Japan rather than an adjustment of the market to its natural equilibrium, because I think we're probably not far from there already.
Adam, I also want to ask you about the ECB and, of course, Euro. So we spoke to the central bank governor of, the Portuguese official, actually, on the ECB board. And he was saying, the ECB must see inflation moving to 2% to slow hikes. Here he is.
We really need to see inflation converging to 2% in the medium term. And the medium term is 24-25. If we are close enough to that target in our forecast, we can certainly pause this process of hiking. But let me be quite precise. What is important, our interest rate needs to converge at some point to what we call the neutral rate. And we will do it because that's the nominal anchor that we need in monetary policy. And I think we have it in sight.
So that was Mario Centeno. Adam, do you expect ECB to lift, by 50 basis points in March?
Yes, we do. I think the debate really is where rates go beyond the March meeting. But for that meeting, the ECB's guidance has been very clear. And I think the hurdle is high for them not delivering the 50 basis point hike that they've set us up for. So, yes, we're very much in that camp.
So what happens after next month? Some of the more hawkish members, already signal that actually more big hikes could be on the way. And where do you expect euro-dollar to be by year-end?
So I think, like the Fed, the ECB are very much data dependent. So it will depend on the incoming CPI data, incoming data on the lead indicators of inflation on the sort of policy relevant horizon. So what they see in the labour market and wage developments. If things come in as suggested by the ECB's latest staff forecasts, then we are close to the end of the hiking cycle with possibly one or two more moves beyond the March meeting, but close to the end of the cycle, as is the case for the Fed. As I say, I think the precise timing of the peak of the cycle is dependent on incoming data, which is where the ECB will be looking for direction.
Thank you so much for joining us, Adam Cole, Chief Currency Strategist there at RBC. Now, coming up, a slew of UK economic data is due this week. We'll also break down what that means and what to watch out for next. That's shortly, and this is Bloomberg. Well, we get UK wage and inflation data this week. Economists expect the readings will show consumer prices are still rising by more than 10% a year, backing the BOE's decision to continue to hike rates. Meanwhile, concerns are mounting about a wage price spiral in Britain. Well, here with us is, of course, our UK correspondent, Lizzie Burden. So, Lizzie, good morning. What can we expect from these two separate reports?
Well, Francine, we already had the GDP data on Friday showing that we dodged a recession in the UK, but these are the figures that will be the deciding factor for the Monetary Policy Committee before the Bank of England's March decision. So we get the jobs data tomorrow, expected to show the labour market is still tight. We've had a report overnight from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development showing that employers are expecting to raise pay at the fastest rate on record. If you're getting your annual review anytime soon, take note. And you're also getting the inflation data on Wednesday, expected to show, as you say, that inflation is still stubbornly high in double digits, even if we're past the peak. So both of them give ammo for another hike at the March meeting, even though it's expected to just be a quarter point.
Lizzie, when you look at UK businesses, so UK PLC, what do they want from the Chancellor?
Well, they're getting their demands in because we've got the March budget coming up, and really they want the growth agenda to be prioritised and they want to be incentivised to make it happen. So they want tax breaks. We know the super deduction on capital investments going to expire at the end of March. They want business rates to be cut, 'twas ever thus. Always small businesses want business rates to be cut. But they also want help shrinking this hole in the labour market. There's a brilliant story on the Terminal and in Business Week about childcare as a way of helping to get people into work. But also they want immigration to be reviewed. Politically very difficult, economically as well. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, told us on Bloomberg TV he's got limited headroom, he wants to focus on inflation, but if he can, what he would like to do is business tax breaks.
Yep, so we'll see if he can get anything done. Then we had a Bank of England official actually talking earlier this morning, and it was quite incredible, saying Brexit cost each household £1,000.
Yes, and this is Haskell, Jonathan Haskell, but he's adding to the chorus of MPC members who are being more vocal about Brexit. So we already had Hugh Pill and Catherine Mann talking about the inflationary impacts, and so you can sense that the bank's getting a little more bold in its commentary on Brexit, and perhaps so they should, given the time has past enough that they can separate the difference between Brexit and COVID and the war in Ukraine?
Lizzie, thanks so much. Lizzie Burden, there, our UK correspondent. Now, we'll be covering all things UK every week on Thursdays. That's at 9:30 a.m. in our half-an-hour UK special, so don't miss that. In the meantime, this is what markets are doing. Of course, stocks pretty much muted. Their investors positioning themselves for an action-packed week, including the release of U.S. consumer price data that may actually confirm the inflation battle is not over. Now, Treasuries range-bound yesterday, following a pretty big sell-off in U.S. government debt on Friday. And that actually pushed up the 10-year Treasury yield. I don't know if we have Treasuries. Maybe we do. The U.S. 10-year Treasury yield by 7 basis points. Again, what we find out this week, investors reassessing how high U.S. interest rates will rise this year, with inflation and jobs data likely to come in hot later this week. Coming up, mystery balloons. Aliens probing our atmosphere. Yes, we'll bring you the latest as UFO fever grips Washington and the world. This is Bloomberg. Investors brace for key U.S. inflation data tomorrow as hopes for a Fed pivot start to fade. U.S. fighters down a fourth flying object as tensions rise between Washington and Beijing. A Chinese news outlet says authorities there are preparing to down a UFO near a naval base. Plus, the death toll in Turkey and Syria from last week's earthquakes approaches 35,000. A business group sees an $84 billion hit to the Turkish economy. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance, everyone. This is Early Edition, and I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, U.S. forces have shot down 4 unidentified objects over North America in less than 2 weeks, and a third in as many days. The latest object was taken down over Lake Huron in Michigan over the weekend. It comes roughly 1 week after the U.S. downed an alleged Chinese spy balloon off the coast of South Carolina. Now, in the past hour, China has also said that U.S. balloons have trespassed more than 10 times since last year. Well, joining us now is Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you so much. Elisabeth, when you look at what exactly has been happening over the last 4 days, like what's going on? I don't think the U.S. had shot an object on U.S. airspace ever, and now there are 4 objects.
That's right. It's really the craziest sequence of events, I think, any U.S. citizen has seen in recent memory. So what happened, as your viewers will recall, is that a few days ago, a spy balloon or a balloon was spotted over U.S. airspace, and at that point, it wasn't clear whose it was. The U.S. thought it was the Chinese balloon. China said, well, it's nothing to do with us. And after a while, they said, oh, it's a weather balloon. It's nothing to worry about. Then the U.S. shot it down after it had left U.S. airspace, as your viewers will recall. And it was indeed some sort of surveillance balloon. And now we have 3 more objects that have been shot down, and also reports over these past few days that there have been additional Chinese objects traversing U.S. airspace in recent months, and even during the Trump administration. So there has clearly been something going on. And with this Chinese spy balloon, the U.S. sort of caught on to, or the U.S. authorities sort of caught on to the fact that something was flying through their airspace and that they needed to do something.
But Elisabeth, yeah, I mean, I have to say, it's just so bizarre. And we saw the situation where there was, the second quarter of the Super Bowl, which is huge in America, and Pentagon officials were trying to field questions about possible extraterrestrials. So what's the truth in this? Is it very mundane? Have we just not been able to see some of these flying objects in the past?
It is crazy that we are talking about extraterrestrials as a part of just standard daily discourse. It used to be considered totally outlandish to talk about extraterrestrials. Here we are. I think what is clear is that the Chinese government has been sending something into U.S. airspace in recent years. And this is part of this new form of warfare that we are seeing increase between different countries, that they target one another not with traditional military means but with other means. And if you do that, it's much harder for the other side, so the defending country, to figure out what to do. So if it's a spy balloon, well, do you shoot it down? First of all, how do you know it's a spy balloon before you shoot it down? And so it's much harder for the defending country to figure out what to do, which I think is the whole point of this, to show that the defending country doesn't really know what to do, and to embarrass its authorities in front of the citizens of that country and in front of the world.
At the same time, China has stepped up accusations over the Biden administration, saying that, you know, the U.S. had sent balloons, I think about 10 balloons since 2022. Is there any truth on that, Elisabeth? I mean, is this just kind of what big countries do, spy on each other with balloons?
What is true is that countries of many different sizes use satellites to spy on each other. We should remember that even in the 50s, there was an intelligence surveillance program on the US side, and there was also one on the Soviet side, but the one on the US side resulted in the downing of the aircraft piloted by Gary Powers, very dramatic moment in Cold War history. But in terms of what the Chinese authorities say, I think it's safe to assume at this point that we should take what they say with a grain of salt. We should remember how they obfuscated, for example, the spread of the coronavirus, COVID-19, in its early days, regardless of how it originated. The Chinese authorities obfuscated regarding the spread of it, and that's as a result of it, it kept spreading in China and in the rest of the world. And there has been similar obfuscation from the Chinese authorities regarding things like forced labor in Xinjiang, and indeed existence of any sort of persecution of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang, even though it has been documented by independent authorities. So I think it's safe to assume at this point that unless an alleged U.S. espionage balloon program is confirmed by other sources, we shouldn't take that as the truth.
So what do we know about the direction of relations between the world's two largest economies, Elisabeth?
It is that relationship is on a collision course. It has been obvious for at least a couple of years, and indeed a few years, that the U.S. government is keen to make its economy less dependent on China than it has been over the past 3 decades, and that's what we are seeing. Various reshoring program, the CHIPS Act, for example, that supports chip production in America. In the past, America and indeed other countries were fine with having all kinds of products manufactured in China, including very high-tech ones. Now the U.S. wants to bring more of that production home because it's seen as too risky to depend on China, especially as relations in the geopolitical realm, as those relations deteriorate. So we are seeing an accelerating collision between these two countries. Now, we have to remember that they have to collaborate on certain subjects, such as climate change, but it is a very tense moment.
But is it, Elisabeth, actually quite good for the U.S. election cycle, given we're not too far away from the next presidential election, 2024, and China bashing could do well with electorates on both sides of the aisle?
You are right that ordinary Americans are concerned about China and are increasingly concerned about China. And I think what is so fascinating is that back when offshoring to China began in earnest in the late 80s and early 90s, then those who protested were seen as hopelessly backwards and not with it. And now those people, especially in manufacturing cities in America, those people have been proven right. It wasn't wise to offshore all these jobs to China. And we're seeing, as a result, these efforts to bring jobs back, especially in high-tech manufacturing. But as you say, it is also the case that American politicians are picking up on this sentiment among the American public. Of course, they have the additional state of affairs to deal with that China is behaving quite aggressively. So it's not just an electoral ploy, but certainly this is something that voters are concerned about on both sides of the aisle, and it plays quite well. In fact, I would argue that China is the only subject that unites people of all ideological, of the whole range of ideological persuasions in America today.
Elisabeth, thank you so much. Elisabeth Braw, our senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, coming up, we'll bring you the latest from the growing humanitarian, political, and economic impact of those massive earthquakes that hit Turkey and Syria a week ago. We'll leave you with some live images from Gaziantep in Turkey near the earthquake's epicenter.
Wall Street prepares for the latest read on inflation.
There's a huge amount of uncertainty out there.
We're going to get some lumpy numbers.
Will annual rates continue to fall?
If we get a hotter print, how much does that really take some of the momentum out?
Instant reaction on Bloomberg Surveillance.
The data have come in stronger than expected.
Or are they literally making it up as they go?
Plus an exclusive interview with Richmond Fed President Thomas Barkin.
It just makes sense to steer more deliberately.
February 14th might have something to say about that.
Inflation in Focus, tomorrow on Bloomberg.
Inflation will come down, but I think it'll stay persistent for a period of time, probably longer than we originally anticipated when they started bringing interest rates up. I personally am optimistic that we will find a balance point in the 5% range. That's my personal view. Of course, I'm this one person's view. But I also think that we will end up staying there for longer.
Adina Friedman, the NASDAQ chair and chief executive officer, sharing her outlook for inflation at the Saudi Capital Market Forum. Now, economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News with Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. 3 flying objects have been downed over North America in as many days, with another reportedly spotted over a Chinese port city. U.S. fighter jets shot down objects over Alaska and Canada on Friday and Saturday, and another over Michigan yesterday, less than 10 days after a balloon was downed off the coast of Carolina. According to a Chinese news outlet, Beijing is preparing to down an unidentified object flying near the port city of Qingdao, a city home to a major naval facility. Now, OPEC's top official is urging countries to invest much more in oil to meet the world's future energy needs. The Secretary General of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries says climate policies need to be more balanced and fair, and policymakers need to look at the big picture. As search and rescue efforts near the 1-week mark, Turkey has widened its investigation into contractors after the collapse of buildings in 2 massive earthquakes. Nearly 35,000 people have been confirmed dead across Turkey's southeast and Syria, with many still unaccounted for. A Turkish business group says the financial cost of the earthquakes could reach $84 billion. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans, and this is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now let's get more on the situation in Turkey. And the country's justice minister says at least 34 contractors are being investigated for potentially shoddy construction work. That's as the scale of the international support needed to rebuild homes becomes clearer. Now joining us now is Selva Bahar Baziki from Bloomberg Economics. Selva, the humanitarian cost, of course, of the quake is very high. What does it mean economically?
Yeah, it's an immense humanitarian disaster. We've taken a look at what it could mean in terms of the fiscal hit. We've looked at a previous case of a similarly sized quake from the province of Van in 2011. We've multiplied the public spending there by the magnitude, the relative magnitude of the current hit, and also the economic size of the immediate provinces around the epicenter. That has led to a calculation of 2.6% of GDP in the short term. And if we were to take a longer point of view and look at the rebuilding as well, that could take it to a total sum of 5.5% of GDP. Now, we've only looked at the 2 cities around the epicenter. In fact, the impacted area is much larger at 10 provinces. And we also expect the government to roll out a credit program, Treasury-backed, targeting the 10 provinces. So then that should really push up the estimate that we've given you. But there's still many unknowns in terms of how much of the infrastructure is hit and what the terrain is like and how much of the damage is actually suffered.
So, Selva, what do we think this will mean for an economy which has already faced, of course, high inflation, unorthodox monetary policy? Like, can the government deal with this cost? A lot of people need to be in a safer environment.
Yeah, I have to say that the government budget starts from a relative position of strength. So the necessary spending that the government will have to do is not going to be creating a long-term problem for the government budget. It's actually the unorthodox policies that the monetary side is practicing that's going to lead to an increased problem that we're going to see the economy face. Bringing down inflation with low monetary policy rates has not yielded the results it was seeking to. Inflation hit a 24-year peak at 85% last year. This took a toll on the currency as well, down by 29% in 1 year, second only to Argentina in the peer emerging economies. So this is going to add to the fragilities, the ongoing unorthodox policies, rather than the fiscal side.
Selva, again, what does this mean politically then from President Erdogan?
Yeah, there is already a lot of discontent among voters because of the high inflation. I mean, 24-year peak at 85. Inflation has receded since then, but still is high, above 50%. That's really putting pressure on purses already stretched thin across the nation. For the quake, let's refer to the excellent reporting done by my news colleagues. They've shown that the delay in government providing immediate rescue and relief to the impacted area has really caused a lot of discontent among citizens. And that's not just focused on the impacted area, but throughout the nation. Finally, let's add that the government's last approach towards building codes, quality enforcement, and oversight might have actually played a hand in seeing numbers as high as we have seen today in terms of the humanitarian toll. And that's really adding to the negative sentiment.
Thank you so much. Selva Bahar-Baziki from Bloomberg Economics joining us this morning. Now, coming up, the SPD also crashes to its worst ever result in Berlin, increasing pressure on the German chancellor to deliver on his agenda. We have more on that story next, and this is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, we just had a terrific briefing on some of the humanitarian help and some of the economic toll, of course, from the horrific quakes that hit last week in Syria and Turkey. We also now understand that Turkey is trying to weigh extending the stock market closure. So we'll bring you up to date with any breaking news out of Turkey or Syria. On to other news, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany, his party has suffered its worst ever result in Berlin, losing out to the CDU in the German capital. Now, for more on all of this, let's get straight to Bloomberg's Oliver Kirk in Berlin. So, Ollie, good morning. What does this mean for the coalition?
So the coalition may actually withstand this, despite the fact that the SPD did worse than they did originally, and obviously the CDU resurged. They'll have a crack at building a coalition, but already it may not be enough for the CDU to take the area. But it's an interesting election, and it's an unscheduled one. It's a rerun of one that happened in 2021, and so that's kind of important context in how we interpret this information and how this happened. The first one was disorganized and chaotic. It happened during the Berlin Marathon, an event that I know, Francine, if you weren't following, you were participating participating in. But the CDU took 10 extra points than they did last time. And that really is a substantial loss for the SPD, which has taken this, since 1999. And a lot of it came down to local issues, housing a major question, but also this sense of chaos, not just in the election, but also on New Year's Eve, where, there are always spirited displays here in Berlin. Fireworks on the street really got out of hand this year, and the CDU really capitalized on the law and order side of it, and maybe the SPD a bit complacent on the campaigning.
Yeah, oh, you're absolutely right. I did my personal best at last marathon, but what can we learn more broadly from this outcome?
And I think that's the question for a lot of people, and it's trying to parse how much of this is idiosyncratically a Berlin story and how much of this is a broader kind of sentiment on Olaf Scholz. I think it's maybe a little bit of both, but probably more restricted to the Berlin side of things. It's certainly a meaningful symbolic victory for the CDU. They suffered their worst loss in history back in 2021, and there's also these questions about the Merkel legacy in the framed, in the context of Russia and the dependence that grew over time on the Russian gas. But it's the first recall in modern German history. The participation rate was only 63% versus 75%. So these are all grains of salt. But if you look at the broader trend in the polling in Germany over time, the CDU has really bounced back since 2021 and the invasion of Russia, now at 27%, the SPD at 20%. But as individual characters, Olaf Scholz is still relatively light compared to Friedrich Merz, the head of the CDU. So certainly something that's getting the SPD's attention this morning. Hard to glean what it means more broadly in terms of German sentiment.
Ollie, thanks so much. Oliver Crook there in Berlin on the back of these Berlin results. Now let's also get to your stocks on the move with our Joe Easton for our equities team. Joe, what do you have?
That's right, Fran. So we're starting with the UK home builders today. Those stocks getting hit, including Persimmon, which we have on the screen here, down 3%, and the worst performer on the FTSE 100 today after Deutsche Bank warns that a lot of the good news on the UK economy and the housing market that we've seen with interest rate expectations coming down, that's now in the price according to Deutsche Bank. They're cutting a number of stocks. Persimmon, Barrett, Taylor Wimpey and Crest Nicholson all downgraded today by Deutsche. Then I'm moving over in technology, staying in the UK space. We've got a little-known firm called Cape Technologies, up 12%. This is a digital security company, and their founder, the Israeli billionaire Teddy Sagi, is going to attempt to buy that stock for 285 pence a piece. He already owns around half of the company. You can see it trading above that price at 291, potentially indicating that we could see a bit of a bidding war coming in for Cape. Then we're moving over to one we've covered a lot, Credit Suisse. That stock getting hit once again today. Analysts at Kepler Cheuvreux saying that this could be a failing franchise given all the wealth management outflows that we saw last week in the earnings report. That stock, you remember, fell 10% on Thursday, down another 4% today for Credit Suisse, having a really bad couple of weeks for that Swiss banking giant. Finally, we're over in France looking at Orpea. This is the retirement home company that had a bit of a scandal last year, given some mismanagement of their funds and also some concerns around some of their practices. They have reported a sales increase today, around 8% jump in their organic revenue. That stock was up 39% in early trading, come back down to around 9%, just above 8% now, as we see on the screen there. A bit of uncertainty in that stock still, but getting a bit of a relief over in Paris.
Thank you so much. Our equities reporter there, Joe Easton. Now, in the meantime, European stocks are actually posting still modest gains overall. I'm looking at Wall Street. Equity futures are pretty much little changed. Investors really trying to position themselves ahead of an action-packed week. Now, this means that we'll get the release of U.S. consumer price data, and that may or may not confirm the inflation battle is not over. It could dash hopes of a Federal Reserve rate pivot. Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour. Matt Miller in New York, Anna Edwards here in London, and this is Bloomberg.
Inflation will come down, but I think it'll stay persistent for a period of time, probably longer than we originally anticipated.
The peak of inflation is clearly in. I certainly think we're not going to see any further rate increases.
You're clearly capturing deflationary forces. The risk is we could see a higher print. If we see a higher print, we will try to read a lot more than we should into that number, and that would derail some of the price action we've enjoyed.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition, with Anna Edwards and Matt Miller.
It's 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 6 p.m. in Hong Kong. Our top stories today. The U.S. shot down a fourth flying object as Washington decides to be more cautious about intrusions. Meanwhile, China says U.S. balloons illegally flew over its territory more than 10 times since early 2022. Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats had its worst ever result in Berlin polls, losing to the Christian Democrats. It was the SPD's first defeat in the city since 1999. And inflation fears swirl. Investors brace for key U.S. inflation data, which risks dashing hopes for a Fed rates pivot. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller in New York. And Matt, a lot is riding on that data print tomorrow out of the US.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, stocks not doing a heck of a lot right now. I'm not saying that they won't move all day long, but certainly tomorrow's data is key for this rally to continue. We did end Friday on a positive note for the S&P 500, down for the NASDAQ. But right now you can see S&P futures doing a whole lot of nothing, down 1/100th of 1%. OK, now completely unchanged. So watch this space. It could be driven maybe by individual movers today. We could have actual fundamentals moving the markets rather than the macro picture that we've all focused on so intensely. You can see the 10-year yield just barely coming up a little bit right now as investors let go a little bit of that debt. 370, 359 is going out 5 significant digits on the 10-year. NYMEX crude coming down about $1. And this is really interesting because we're starting to be concerned about a slowdown globally in terms of growth, even as Russia cuts production. So there's a couple things to factor into crude. Nonetheless, we're back under $80 a barrel at $78.70 for West Texas Intermediate. And Bitcoin falling as well, about 0.6%, just under 22,000 now at $21,616 a piece. In terms of the Asia trade, we did see some gains in China. You see the CSI 300 up about 0.9%. We're going to be focusing in a lot on Chinese economic data in today's program, but just keep in mind, investors were a little bit more bullish this morning, and that could be a bigger deal than Japan, says Simon White, or than the Bank of Japan. You can see at the bottom of the screen here, the dollar strengthening against the yen. Right now, you can buy 132 yen for a U.S. dollar. And then iron ore, I just want to highlight here, down a little bit today, and we have seen some gains recently. So this is taking profits off the table, but also, again, maybe concerns about a slowing economy, concerns about the Chinese data, because this steelmaking material is key to growth. Anna, what do you see in terms of Europe?
Yeah, well, certainly that iron ore story, it jumped out on the GMM screen when I was looking at that earlier. In terms of the European equities picture then, Matt, it looks actually quite positive, broadly positive across European stocks, despite some weakness that we saw through the early part of the European session on US futures. So Europe looking to go slightly its own way. 2/3 of sectors across Europe seem to be in positive territory. So it is quite broad-based, but we are, of course, waiting for that key data print out of the United States tomorrow, and also the BOJ governor nomination. So all of that happening tomorrow, a busy day on Tuesday. Here's Brent crude, just echoing that, what you were saying there, down by 1.3% on the supply side, the Russia story. On the demand side, it's sort of China versus US, the different drivers there. And this is the impact that that move is having on energy stocks. Of course, last week was really positive for energy stocks. A return of cash to shareholders, a real theme from the reporting season from those energy majors. And so they've done really well running into this week. Today, we take some profits, it seems, there. Also taking some profits on the UK housing sector. Persimmon is one of the players in that space. Deutsche Bank cutting its rating on 5 companies that operate in this space. 4 of them it takes down to hold, 1 of them it takes to sell, and that is Persimmon. It's having an impact on the share price there. And 106.81 is where we are on euro dollar. We've actually retrenched quite a bit on the euro recently as the rate story, the dollar story in the United States continues to ask questions as to whether we see higher rates in the US. So that's been weighing on the euro. We just recently heard from the Portuguese central bank governor, who was telling Bloomberg TV that they're going to be very data dependent when it comes to March, of course. We'll wait to see whether they deliver another 50 basis points then.
Yeah, we'll be paying attention to that for sure. The top story, though, today, Anna, has got to be U.S. forces having shot down 4 unidentified objects over North America in less than 2 weeks, and a third in as many days. The latest object was taken down over Lake Huron in Michigan over the weekend. Let's get the latest from Bill Ferries, senior editor for Asia and former U.S. national security team leader in Washington. So, Bill, this comes after, I think the U.S. has rarely shot down any objects over its own territory. Now we have 4 in a couple of weeks. What do we know?
Well, Matt, we know close to nothing so far about these last 3 objects that have been shot down. The Pentagon has been pretty tight-lipped on details. No one has found the wreckage of these things so far. We don't know if they were balloons. We don't know if they were spy craft. We don't know if they were college atmospheric experiments that floated away. We know close to nothing. But it has ratcheted up tensions between U.S. and China. China today coming out and saying that they have spotted or identified 10 U.S. balloons that have flown over their territory over the last year. So this story is continuing. As you said, every morning we wake up with reports of something else in the skies.
Yes, and it's interesting, the things we don't know about here, Bill, when you hear about this phenomenon or these events taking place, you wonder, are there more of these objects? You also wonder if we're just looking harder for them, and we've heard from the Pentagon that that's part of what's been going on here. But you also wonder about the politics, if previously we've just reacted in a very different way to spotting this kind of thing. So how is the politics playing in here?
Well, it's definitely a factor. I mean, you'll remember with that first balloon that was eventually shot down off the coast of South Carolina, the Pentagon later said it had been tracking it for a few days before it became public knowledge. Only when it was spotted by civilians and there was a lot of coverage of it did it become more of a public national security issue. We don't know. The Pentagon has said that it's basically recalibrating some of the ways it looks at the atmosphere to better identify slow-moving objects as opposed to maybe a fleet of incoming enemy fighters. It's looking for things differently, and it seems to be seeing more things. Again, though, we don't know. Some of these objects, the Pentagon said, were just floating in a zone that was dangerous for commercial airliners. We don't know that it was dangerous for national security. Those are the kind of things we're hoping that come out in the coming days.
Bill, thanks very much for joining us. I know you're doing a lot of coverage on this lately. So Bill Ferries putting in the work there on national security as we, I guess, start to count how many objects the U.S. shoots down. Now, let's get over to Germany because Chancellor Olaf Scholz's party has suffered its worst ever election result in Berlin, losing out to the CDU in the German capital. It's the first time the Social Democrats have failed to win an election in the city since 1999. And for anyone who has ever lived there, you'll know it's almost impossible to believe that the Christian Democrats have won a majority in Berlin. Let's go to Oliver Crook right now in the Hauptstadt for the results and the reasons, Oliver. It's so crazy to think that the CDU could win a Berlin vote.
It rather is, Matt, but actually also the conditions around this vote are actually quite relevant in how we interpret these results, right? So this is a rerun of the election that happened back in 2021. It was court-ordered for, among other things, it was held on the same day as the Berlin Marathon, which, as you can imagine, caused all kinds of logistical problems, and so they threw out the results. And since then, from 2021 until now you've seen a jump of 10 percentage points for the CDU. They had like 18%, now 28.2%, overtaking the SPD. As you say, Matt, SPD support stumbled as well as the Greens, but a lot of it came down to local issues. You know, housing is a major concern here in Berlin, Matt. But also, Matt, as you will know, the sort of spirited and lively New Year's celebrations that occur in the streets of Berlin every year really got kind of out of hand this year, and the CDU really hammered that law and order message in trying to kind of rally some of the support. That seemed to have worked, and the SPD also perhaps a bit complacent on their campaigning.
Spirited and lively. Nice description, Ollie. What does this tell us more broadly, though? I mean, is this all about those very local issues, as you've described some of them, and the specific idiosyncrasies around the earlier vote? Or is this about some broader politics to do with the war in Ukraine or other issues?
So I think that's a question for a lot of people, particularly people watching from outside of Germany, and I think that it's important to try to kind of disentangle these two things. So one of them, it's certainly a symbolic, meaningful victory for the CDU, as Matt was pointing out, the kind of the scale of that also lost, by the worst, that they did in 2021. They did very terribly at the polls there on the national level. So this clawing back some space, also dealing with the kind of Merkel legacy now reframed somewhat in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine and the German dependence on gas becoming as a problem. But then you take it a bit with a bit of caution. The bizarre nature of this election. It's the first recall of a German election in modern history. The participation here was 63% versus 75% the first time around. But if you look at the national average polling, you see that the CDU has been creeping up, has been gaining territory since 2021, since the invasion, up at 27% versus the SPD now at 20%. But as an individual figure, Scholz is still relatively popular, particularly compared to Merz. But it's certainly going to get the attention of the Chancellery today, and a warning shot there.
And if the CDU keeps winning, Oliver, you're going to have to wear a tie again. That's going to be a problem. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook for us out of Berlin. Now, we have a busy week ahead with key U.S. inflation data coming out tomorrow. We may have mentioned that we're waiting for CPI and a host of Fed speakers as well. Bloomberg Markets reporter Valerie Teitel joins us to run through the events that could move markets. Valerie?
Yeah, it's really all about the inflation print tomorrow. It's going to be on Tuesday. We get that January CPI print. Will it shift the dots higher? Will it have an effect on where we think the terminal rate for the Fed will be? But don't forget, we also have some bigger data coming out in the later half of the week, including retail sales. Just how well is that household spending holding up? We also get industrial production and housing starts. And this is important because the manufacturing sector and the housing sector, they have shown some weakness. But there's been hints that that might be starting to stabilize. That all ends with PPI later in the day on Thursday after jobless claims. But let me get back to the CPI data. If there is a surprise in January CPI, if it comes from this core services sector, expect the markets to have a big reaction to that. Powell was asked specifically last week in that Q&A, what is his biggest worry? His biggest worry is that the tight labor market will keep core services inflation too sticky for too long. But maybe it'll start to moderate at a pace that they're happy with. We hear from a slew of Fed speakers this week, including 4 after the CPI print on Tuesday. We also hear from Mester, Cook, and Bowman later in the week. Watch out for some hawkish comments, things like the door being open to going at a 50 basis point pace again, or perhaps any direct comments that their dot is moving higher already. Look, perhaps they won't be too that bold. We do have another payroll print and another CPI print before the Fed convenes again on March 22nd.
All right, Valerie, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel giving us what we should watch in the week ahead. Let's take a look at some of the stocks that are moving right now in U.S. pre-market trading. First off, Sorrento Therapeutics on track for its biggest one-day loss since August of 2020. That company filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in Texas. We also have Blue Apron. It may sell shares from time to time through an at-the-money equity offering program. I believe it's about $70 million. That was their regulatory filing, so they can do that. And as a result, you see the shares moving down in the pre-market about 15%. So you have a couple of movers, but really not a heck of a lot going on in a market, Anna, that is waiting with bated breath for more inflation data that the Fed can digest.
Yeah, absolutely. You thought it was just Valentine's Day. Apparently it's not. It's Inflation Day. It's also BOJ Day. So there's a lot going on tomorrow. We will continue to sort of beat the drum ahead of that CPI data. Valerie giving us a nice overview of what to expect there. We'll continue to get insights. And next, we'll talk to Roukaya Ibrahim, Daily Insight strategist at BCA Research. We'll ask her for her views on the CPI and indeed look ahead to the BOJ decisions. And Kansas City comes back to win. We'll have the highlights from the Super Bowl 57. Plus, remote work is costing Manhattan more than $12 billion a year. Look for our latest big take story online or on the Bloomberg terminal. This is Bloomberg.
Wall Wall Street prepares for the latest read on inflation.
There's a huge amount of uncertainty out there.
We're going to get some lumpy numbers.
Will annual rates continue to fall?
If we get a hotter print, how much does that really take some of the momentum out?
Instant reaction on Bloomberg Surveillance.
The data have come in stronger than expected.
Or are they literally making it up as they go?
Plus an exclusive interview with Richmond Fed President Thomas Barkin.
It just makes sense to steer more deliberately.
February 14th might have something to say about that.
Inflation in focus tomorrow on Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Surveillance, the early edition. I'm Matt Miller here in New York. Anna Edwards with us out of London. We are simulcast on both Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television. For those of you watching, you can see a chart here of the record new yuan loans in China. If you're listening, don't worry. It's not that interesting, but maybe it is. Joining us now is Simon White. He's Bloomberg macro strategist to tell us why China is maybe more important than the BOJ for global markets. Simon?
Oh, hi, Matt. I'll do my best. So we had a lot of news out on Friday about China and the potential announcement of the new BOJ governor. Japan's been given kind of main billing so far, but I think the second feature, China, the data out of there, I think will prove more consequential in the short to medium term. And as you had the chart there, you've actually now began to see an expansion in credit in China after many false starts. And also, if you look at money growth, you look at M1, which is one of the best cyclical indicators of what's actually happening in China, as opposed to what's been said. So that now looks like it's beginning to get traction. And I think that has far more kind of like consequence for the next few months than what's happening in Japan.
So that's why that chart was interesting then. It showed a pickup in credit, and as you say, money supply also in focus then, Simon. Which bits of the Chinese economy is this going to benefit? Because then this has direct knock-on into other Asian economies and into Europe, for example, as to who else benefits. Is this an industrial recovery, or is it actually much more about services for this reopening?
So I think it's across the whole economy. The issue with China is when they try and increase credit, it doesn't always get to the parts of the economy that need it most. And when you start to see money growth, M1 specifically, turn up, it's really a sign that that's beginning to reach all corners of the economy. So I think it will have impacts for Europe. I think even more sooner than that, and we've got CPI tomorrow, but in the next few months of CPI leads, I think it could definitely have an upwards thing on global inflation, including US CPI. So I think over the next few months, we've had this trend down in CPI lower. I think that could start to turn up, certainly sooner than I thought it was going to turn up because of this change in China. So that's why I think it's very important.
How concerned are you, Simon, about the geopolitical risks here? I mean, we had, I think just a couple of weeks ago, a U.S. Air Force general predicting war by 2025. You're starting to see tensions ratcheted up over balloons, as shocking as that is. Does it factor in?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is always like an ongoing kind of issue with China, right? The geopolitical risk is always like 1 or 2 years down the line. I think investors kind of have to try and, look through that. It's never going to be something that's irrelevant to them, but, things like looking at the data and what's happening underlying, I think, is a much better kind of indication of what's actually happening. So, for instance, again, looking at real money growth, lots of China bears, perma bears have been up at China, there's been perma bulls. But if you really want to catch the ups and downs of what's been happening with China over the last 10 or 15 years, just follow the money growth. And that would have done you very well.
OK, so following the money growth, that's the key, you think. What about the capital outflows story? What's that been telling us? Because this isn't just about COVID. We've seen capital outflows, it seems, from your report over a number of years, even though although we have recovered from the very depressed levels or the very extreme levels that we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key thing there as well. I mean, China basically, the way it kind of eases, if you like, they end up expanding their export sector. That's fantastic, but for the export sector, but for the household sector, it's terrible. So they've been repressing the household sector to the benefit of the export sector. Now that looks like that's beginning to kind of rein itself in, and liquidity conditions and capital outflow are improving, which is very good for domestic liquidity. So really, it's a lot of things are now coming together. It looks like China's turning a corner. OK, Simon, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Bloomberg's Simon White with the latest on China and its significance. For more market analysis, check out MLIV Go. That is the location of the Markets Live blog. They'll be all over the BOJ, the Chinese reopening story, and indeed the CPI print tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in New York with Anna Edwards in London. Now, keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. Turkey has begun collecting blood samples to identify the victims of the 2 earthquakes that struck the country's southeast a week ago, the death toll mounting to nearly 35,000 in Turkey and neighboring Syria. A Turkish business group estimates that the economic losses from the earthquake could reach $84 billion. Meanwhile, Turkey has widened its investigation into contractors after the collapse of those buildings. Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon is reported to have said he should have acted sooner to cut jobs. The FT says he told a private meeting that the layoffs would have been less drastic had he reacted when signs of a slowdown began to emerge in the second quarter of last year. Goldman is slashing 6.5% of its headcount, one of its largest rounds of job reductions in history. Citi is nearing the sale of its Mexican retail bank, Banamex. The Financial Times reporting the deal could value it at up to $8 billion. Grupo Mexico owner Germán Larrea is in exclusive talks to purchase Banamex. And the Kansas City Chiefs beat the Philadelphia Eagles 38-35 in the Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes helped deliver the win with an injured ankle. He threw 2 touchdown passes in the fourth quarter and ran 26 yards before Harrison Butker kicked a 27-yard field goal with 8 seconds left, leading the Chiefs to victory. There will be, though, a lot of questions about how big a role officials played in this game, Anna.
We'll get back to the markets next. We'll talk to Daily Insight strategist at BCA Research, Roukaya Ibrahim. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Here's what you need to know. The U.S. shot down a 4th flying object as Washington decides to be more cautious about intrusions. Meanwhile, China says U.S. balloons illegally flew over its territory more than 10 times since early 2022. Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats had its worst ever result in Berlin polls, losing to the Christian Democrats. It was the SPD's first defeat in the city since 1999. And inflation fears swirl. Investors brace for key U.S. inflation data, which risks dashing hopes for a Fed rate pivot. I'm Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller in New York. And Matt, the markets are focused on the inflation data. That is no doubt the case, but very highly read on the Bloomberg terminal any story about these unidentified objects being shot down in American and Canadian airspace and potentially also perhaps over in China in the future. This story certainly gripping a lot of people.
Yeah, I think I read that the Pentagon cannot confirm that none of the objects are not extraterrestrial. So there could be aliens coming here that now we have shot down. And I fear we have awoken a sleeping giant. Let's take a look at what's going on in terms of financials this morning. We're not seeing a lot of movement on futures. There they are. S&P futures down only 0.05%. It's not just the CPI data, right? We heard Valerie Teitel earlier say we have a slew of Fed speakers this week, and that has the potential to drive the markets in either direction. So investors may be sitting on their hands, waiting until they see which way it's going to go before they place their bets. U.S. 10-year yield also very much unchanged right now at 370, 340. Still a relatively high level. You know, we had been seeing 350 and below for quite some time until this most recent climb. And then we see NYMEX crude coming down $1.10 a barrel to 78.62. This is West Texas Intermediate, but Brent crude is also coming down pretty substantially on concerns that the global growth just isn't there to support the demand. This even after Russian supply cuts of 500,000 barrels a day were announced last week. And then Bitcoin down below 22,000 at 21,573. We've got some interesting stories in crypto today. Binance has been told by its partner Paxos that they won't be minting any more of its BUSD coins. And of course, last week we had that ruling on Kraken and the move from Coinbase in terms of staking. So a lot to talk about in crypto, which we will do still with Kaylee Lines tomorrow at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. In terms of pre-market movers, just a couple to note. One is a big bankruptcy. So Sorrento Therapeutics on track for its biggest one-day loss since August of 2020. It filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy bankruptcy protection in Texas. This company, the stock had been more than decimated last year, but had been making a recovery this year until the bankruptcy filing. And then Blue Apron may offer and sell shares from time to time through an at-the-market equity offering program up to a total of $70 million announced in regulatory filings last week. So investors may be bracing for that with a sale of those shares in the pre-market down 13%. Anna, what do you see in Europe?
Yeah, it's interesting that U.S. equity markets offering a little bit of a downward focus, whereas European stocks offering something different, up by 0.3%, although those U.S. futures off earlier lows, of course. So a pretty broad-based rally going on for European stocks, even if it is modest, waiting for those big set-piece events around the BOJ and the inflation print out of the U.S. and all of the other data that you mentioned, Matt, as well. Brent crude, Matt has already talked about what's going on with WTI, down by 1.3%. The Russia side on the supply narrative. Then you've got the U.S. versus China and the demand narrative. Persimmon is a house builder in the UK, down by 2.75% today. We've seen Deutsche Bank reassigning ratings to operators in the housing market here in the UK. And in fact, 4 of those companies they've taken down to hold, but 1 to sell, and that's Persimmon, and that's having an impact on the share price. And 106.82 is where we trade on the euro dollar. So this worth checking in on ahead of that CPI data that we get tomorrow out of the United States. Previous data, of course, has pushed the dollar higher and led to some weakness in the euro. That's been the very recent developments over the last couple of weeks or so because of that strong jobs report we saw out of the United States. Also, the European growth story keeps getting upgraded. We've seen this from a number of banks, and now we're seeing it from the European Commission just this morning, saying that they're not expecting quite such a challenging time for the Eurozone economy right now. Matt?
All right, joining us to talk about really the big macro themes is Roukaya Ibrahim, Daily Insight Strategist at BCA Research. Roukaya, thanks so much for joining the program. We had a great story on the Bloomberg yesterday saying, regardless of what you make of Kazuo Ueda, the new BOJ, or reportedly the new BOJ leader, we've already started to see money coming back to Japan from around the world. And you could see $2 trillion come out of global bond markets heading back home in yen. What do you think of the BOJ and the possibility of rates floating up as an attractor, I guess, as a tractor beam for money from global bond markets?
I think that's probably the cyclical story for Japan. I think that what we're seeing right now in Japan is that we're seeing some positive economic surprises. We got the Economy Watcher survey last week that showed the expectations component of that survey increased quite a bit, beat expectations by quite a bit. We also got inflation and wage data recently, which is still quite perky. It hasn't rolled over like it has in other parts of the world. And I think that's probably what's going to drive BOJ policy going forward. I think the fact that, or the likelihood that Ueda is going to take over as the next BOJ governor sort of increases the odds that policy is going to be pragmatic over the future. And I think that probably raises the likelihood that they're going to eventually exit the yield curve control policy and reduce reduce how much easing is needed for the economy.
Yeah, Roukaya, good to see you. So if we are going to see a pragmatic approach, what would a pragmatic approach to the data in Japan look like? I mean, they haven't been seeing the same inflationary pressures as other economies outside Japan, but they have started to see more inflationary pressure over recent months. How do things look to you?
Absolutely. I think if wage data and inflation data continues as we've been seeing it recently, that could put pressure on the BOJ to exit their ultra easing policy. Now, I don't think that's going to happen right away. Like I said, Ueda is going to be pragmatic. He's not going to come in and implement any policy changes right away, but it could be sometime around the summertime where we start to see maybe lifting the yield curve control cap, and that's going to support the yen, I think, on a cyclical horizon. Not to mention also that the yen is extremely undervalued. It fell quite a bit last year, and so I think macro forces are moving in its favor now.
We were talking earlier on in the programme, Roukaya, about iron ore. Matt was referencing the price retreating on uncertainty over the Chinese reopening story and how much that adds to steel demand. How much do you see China reopening as about industrials, construction, and how much of it is really going to be confined to the services sector? Where should we put our emphasis?
Yeah, I think that's really the story here, is that there's going to be a dichotomy within the Chinese economy. I think the lockdowns have really impacted the service sector much more than they impacted the manufacturing sector. So the services, the consumer services sector is really what's going to benefit the most out of the reopening, whereas the manufacturing sector still faces headwinds from global demand coming off its pandemic highs, and that's going to be something that's going to limit how the benefit for the manufacturing sector. And if you take a look at the construction sector, the property market challenges are still there, and that's going to limit how much the benefit of the reopening is going to give to industrial metals such as iron ore, copper, which have already rallied quite significantly on news of the reopening. So I think that there is scope for them to come down a little bit, because I think they probably overshot what the macro fundamentals just warrant.
Roukaya, even after all of your work at BCA, I'm sure looking into historical recessions and unique events that led to them, all your studies at McGill in economics, even with all of that, are you prepared to forecast a recession after the kind of global pandemic that we've had, after the kind of fiscal stimulus that we've had, after the really seemingly unique situation, unprecedented situation? Can you really draw any references from historical periods to help you shape your view of the future now?
I think we're living in unprecedented times. It's very tricky to get a read on what's happening with the economy. The soft data is much more positive than what we're seeing from the it's much more, the soft data, we've seen a lot of improvement in the soft data. Things like the ZOO, the Sentex, the IFO, those are all improving. But there's still some negativity, for example, from PMIs. Whereas when we take a look at the hard data, that's extremely strong. If you take a look at the labor market, that's extremely strong. So I think that there's a lot of mixed messages going on in the economy, and that makes it very difficult to forecast what's going to happen next. But I think what we're doing is we're really watching what is happening with the data very closely, what the implications are for the Fed, and that's going to be the best guide of what's going to happen coming up, because they're doing exactly what we're doing. They're watching the data and basing their policy on that.
So we added 517,000 jobs last month, and we revised upward a lot of the previous data. If we get, inflation coming down more than expected, or if we get a beat, which way does it go tomorrow after the CPI?
I think what matters more probably is looking deeper into the components of CPI rather than if it's a beat or what happens to headline or core number. I think what we're watching most closely is the ex-housing core services component that Powell has repeatedly highlighted as what they're most concerned about. And I think that's really what matters over the next few, or the coming CPI and PCE reports, in addition to the labor market report, which, if we get other signs that the labor market is still extremely tight, I think that's going to point to continued upside pressure on this component of CPI.
Roukaya, thank you very much. Roukaya Ibrahim of BCA Research, thanks very much for joining us. Coming up, we'll get back to the geopolitics. The US shoots down another flying object in American airspace. We will discuss the significance next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. You're looking live at the Principal Room. Coming up later today, an interview with Steve Eisman, Senior Portfolio Manager at Neuberger Berman Eisman Group. That's at 8 a.m. New York time. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in New York with Anna Edwards in London. And Anna, it does look like we're going to be focused very much this week on not only inflation and what the Fed does, but what we're shooting out of the sky here over the U.S. Previously, the U.S. military had never, at least as far as we know, shot anything out of the sky above the United States of America. And now we've shot down, 4 flying objects in a couple of weeks, and they could be aliens, apparently.
Well, they could be. I mean, not ruling anything out, I think, was the words of the Pentagon. Yes, 3 over the US, 1 over Canada, just in the last few weeks or so. And of course, when we start to see more of this being reported, Matt, we ask ourselves questions as to whether this data, whether we really are seeing an uptick in the number of these objects, or are we just looking a lot harder for them? And that was certainly something that the Department of Defense was pointing to, the fact that they've changed the way that they use their radar on this, maybe at different altitudes, looking for slightly different things, as we were hearing from Bill Ferries earlier on. Or was it that we just knew about these things all the time, but have just, the US, I should say, has changed the way it responds to them? Which of these applies, I suppose, is still up in the air.
I think, the interesting thing is that since in reality they're unlikely to be extraterrestrials, right? We are now realizing there's so much more stuff at ultra-high altitudes than maybe we previously would have thought. But some people have pointed out this could be even college experiments, right? Weather experiments, maybe even, solar testing models. So it could be anything up there. And it does seem like we're just looking more than we previously had. And I guess we're shooting first and asking questions later. Certainly,
well, indeed,
it didn't look great when we allowed that Chinese spy balloon, reported spy balloon, or alleged spy balloon, to float all the way over North America from basically Alaska to the Carolinas before we shot it down over the sea. And it seems like the U.S. military, the U.S. administration is becoming a lot more proactive now than it had been during that week.
Yes, absolutely. And so you wonder how much domestic politics in the United States, and you'll know this better than me, Matt, is playing in here. Substantial criticism from the Republicans that object wasn't shot down on sight, and therefore the Democrats choosing to take a different path with these objects that have more recently been seen. But I suppose geopolitically, what's really interesting here is we've had no confirmation that any of these other objects are of Chinese origin, but it's interesting the way that this is playing into those tensions. And in the context of a sort of New Year pivot in the relationship. We had seen a thawing of relations between the US and China. That was the intention. We were supposed to see the Secretary of State visiting China and adding to that sense that things were getting better between these two superpowers. But, Matt, that doesn't seem to be the case, especially when early on in the European hours, we tracked the foreign ministry briefing in China daily, and this was the topic of conversation once again, the way that America is now shooting these objects out of the sky.
Right, and the fact that now China claims that 10 U.S. spy balloons have floated over its territory, just to make things even murkier. All right, we'll continue to focus on this story surely throughout the day, if not the rest of the year. But coming up in other ways to look at it, we're going to have Eurasia Group President Ian Bremmer. That's at 8:30 a.m. New York, 1:30 p.m. London time. He focuses on these geopolitical issues, and I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about the balloon and the other, as of now, unidentified flying objects. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller in New York. Now a look at what is ahead this week. On Tuesday, we will get US CPI data at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, the big data point of the week, really. UK inflation also out, though. That's on Wednesday, as well as retail sales from the United States. On Thursday, the slew of US economic data continues. We get US PPI at 8:30 Eastern. On Friday, the Munich Security Conference begins with arms donations to Ukraine sure to be a hot topic, and possibly they'll be discussing what's been going on in the skies over the US and Canada, Matt.
Yes, let's talk even more about that. The U.S. shot down a third flying object in as many days. It's the fourth in North American airspace this month. The Defense Department doesn't yet know what the most recent objects are, but they approached sensitive military sites, reportedly, and posed a potential threat to commercial aviation, apparently, as well. Roz Matheson, Bloomberg Senior Executive Editor for Government, joins us now. So, Roz, what can you tell us? I guess this is going to become a common occurrence.
Well, it looks like it. The question is, was this occurring, in fact, before this and potentially for many years. What we know is that countries have always spied on each other, and it seems as though these balloons may have been going back and forth from various countries around the world for years. We know, of course, that some went across the US during the Trump administration, for example. So why is it becoming such a big deal now all of a sudden? Is it because this one balloon flew so close to the ground that it got spotted by a farmer out in Montana and therefore set off this chain reaction, and what was quietly understood to be a pattern of behaviour with balloons floating around in the atmosphere has suddenly become something very different?
What does this tell us about China-US relations, Roz, at this point?
Well, that's the thing, of course. Even if these three latter objects turn out to be very benign, perhaps they were weather balloons from another country, or they were junk or something else that was floating around, and really we've only talking about this one particular surveillance balloon, or alleged surveillance balloon, over the US and the one that went across Latin America. What it does say is that the window for an improvement in ties between the US and China has to be narrowing. Of course, we had the presidents of US and China meeting late last year, and really an effort to put a floor under the relationship. But as this drags on, and perhaps as the allegations come thick and fast, of course, China is now accusing the US of putting balloons over its territory. Does that shut the door on this opportunity to really have at least a brief thaw in ties?
All right, Roz, thanks so much for joining us. Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson there talking to us about an issue that we will no doubt continue to cover for you. Let's get, though, to the Super Bowl, shall we? Super Bowl 57 came to an end with the Kansas City Chiefs beating the Philadelphia Eagles 38-35. Joining us now is Michael Barr, co-host of Bloomberg's Business of Sports and a news anchor at Bloomberg Radio. Michael, thanks for joining us this early. You're usually here before I am, I will tell our viewers. Were you able to stay up and watch the whole Super Bowl last night?
Yes, I did.
Now, I heard Truman told me it was an amazing game.
It was a great game up until about a minute and a half left in the game. And everybody's going to talk about the Bradbury penalty that the refs called. Not one ref now can go into Philadelphia, because Philadelphia, they feel like they got robbed. And it was, let's be honest, it was a ticky-tack call.
Now, this has been the story of the NFL for me all season long. The refs make bad calls, or the refs make unwanted calls. The refs decide the fate of the game, the winner and the loser. That's not how it should be, right? Why doesn't the NFL do something about this?
Well, if you ask Roger Goodell, he said the refereeing has never been any better. Which, you know, I guess if you're a fan of the league, all this happens when we got instant replay and we could see this all over again, and then some fans feel, and they still got it wrong. And what happened to James Bradbury, I mean, he admitted he grabbed the jersey. But, I mean, let him play at this point. That changed the whole game.
Okay, Michael, it's very nice to see you quite so early here in New York. So thank you very much for joining us. I will not pretend to know very much about what was happening on the pitch, but what was happening off it was really fascinating in terms of the ad spend. Let's talk business of sport. Well, there you go. I gave myself away there. I'm in the wrong geography, the wrong time zone to appreciate the Super Bowl. But ad spending not coming from the same place as it came from last year. That's for sure. That's
true, and there were some memorable ads. I know people are saying that, well, maybe it wasn't. Now, the one that was just airing right now with John Hamm, that was a funny ad. And then with Kevin Hart, that was also a humorous ad. There were some good ads out there. I think the best one I love, there was supposed to be the fight between Coors Light beer and Miller Lite, and it turned out that it was a Blue Moon commercial. And that was really funny to me, so that stuck out.
Well, and we got some breaking news, right? At the halftime show, apparently Rihanna is pregnant.
Yeah, I'm looking at the halftime show, and all of a sudden, I can't find a delicate way to put it. I saw a pokey stomach, and I'm like, wait a minute, she's pregnant. It's like, and then the news came out. Yeah, she's expecting. And was it ASAP she had the first baby with?
I don't know. But apparently she did a great job, a medley of all her songs, didn't bring on any... I thought Chris Stapleton was quite good at the beginning, singing the Star Spangled Banner. And I noticed that he drove up in Ram Rev, their new electric truck. And Ram had a number of ads there, too. So, Michael Barr, thank you so much for joining us. Pleasure having you here with us on set. Bloomberg's Michael Barr. You can check out his podcast, The Business of Sports. And Anna, I guess... maybe I'll help you brush up on your NFL for next year.
Yeah, you should. You should. I thought Rihanna's performance was pretty spectacular, very impressive staging. I'll stick to what I know about, shall I? Right, that's it for Early Edition. Surveillance is ahead. This is Bloomberg.